Magnus Carlsen, the GOAT and the undisputed king of new chess openings, right here in this position, he busts out a brand new opening versus his longtime rival, Fabiano Caruana, starting with the Bongcloud style move. Yes, that's right, king to f2. Magnus Carlsen inventing the Norwegian Bongcloud opening in this game, but let's go back to the very beginning. In the game here, Magnus playing as white opens 1c4, the English opening, and black does go e5. We have the king's English on the board. Now from here, both sides follow one of the absolute main lines of this opening. We continue knight c3, knight to f6, and now finally 3g3. Magnus here simply trying to fianchetto his bishop on g2, exerting pressure on the d5 square with his pawn, his bishop, and his knight. Now here, Fabiano plays one of the main lines, bishop b4, the reversed Rosolimo Sicilian, and black here, his idea is simple. He's developing, setting up castling, and also pressuring this weak knight on c3. Black at any point can take on c3, doubling white's pawns and ruining his pawn structure on the queen's side. Now here, Magnus, the main moves are bishop g2, perhaps d3, and so on, but Magnus here on move 4 busts out a really wild idea. He plays the move e4, heading for some sort of accelerated Botvinnik English opening, which, I mean, right here, this is completely insane. You don't simply go e4 when black has this kind of pressure on your knight on c3. And here, Fabiano, he is not letting up. He's not going to let this slide, and he simply takes on c3, permanently ruining white's pawn structure on the queen's side. Now, here is the big question. Which pawn do you take back with on the queen's side, the b pawn or the d pawn? Well, Magnus being the GOAT, he finds the right response, and he finds the move b takes c3, recapturing towards the center and setting up the idea of d4, expanding in the center in just a little bit. Now, real fast, black here, the pawn on the e4 square is hanging. Yes, that is true. However, this pawn should not be taken. If black takes it with the knight, then white can go, for example, queen d2 or queen g4, hitting the knight, hitting g7, and so on, and it's just not a good idea for black in general. Instead, castles is the move for Caruana, a solid move. And now Magnus, f3, the reversed Ben Feingold counterattack, reinforcing e4 with the f-pawn instead of the bishop. Magnus, don't you know when you go g3, the idea, obviously, is bishop g2, obviously, that's the idea. But no, Magnus, f3, reinforcing e4 with the f-pawn, and things get even more insane one move later. Fabiano, rook to e8 is the move. And here in this position, Magnus busts out both a move and an idea that has never been seen before in this variation, making it a brand new opening, and that is the move king to f2, the Bongcloud style move. Magnus artificially is castling his king on the f2 square behind the f-pawn. And was that the real idea behind f3, vacating f2 for the king, not just defending e4, but setting up the Bongcloud style advance of the king towards the center? All right, from here, black, he's got many ideas. The computer here loves the idea of b5, which makes no sense to me, but that is the top engine choice. Instead, Fabiano, c6 played in the game, setting up the d5 advance. Now, Magnus here, d5 is coming. Your king on f2 makes no sense. So far, you only have pawn moves and king moves played on the board. How do you want to proceed? Well, Magnus here, he is not letting up. He plays the move d4, fighting for the center with literally pawns and his king on f2. And Fabiano, he knows when the king's on the f2 square, you simply blow open the center, and he plays the move d5, achieving the famous, infamous pawn trapezoid. 5 pawns all attacking each other nonstop in the center. Anything can happen from here. Magnus, how does he proceed? Well, he takes on d5. Black takes back from a trapezoid to a square in the center of the board. Now from here, Magnus, he takes on the e5 square. D takes e5, the right recapture. Instead, e takes d5 is much weaker, as then after knight takes black here is just pummeling c3. He's got too much pressure and is simply not a good look for white. So instead, d takes e5 chosen in the game. Now black takes with the rook. Rook takes e5, and now Magnus takes the game from weird to absolutely insane with yet another pawn move. Magnus here, it's move 10. He's only moved pawns and his king so far in this game, besides perhaps the knight, but that piece was knocked off the board a long time ago. So Magnus here, only having pawn moves and king moves, what does he do right here? He makes another pawn move in this new opening, the Norwegian Bongcloud, and he plays the move c4. This is just too much. What on earth is the idea? Well, it's very simple. This pawn on d5 is overloaded and it's pinned to the queen on d8. If black takes either pawn, you lose the queen and the game. Therefore, Magnus here piling up pressure on the pin piece, which happens to be the pawn in this game. Now, black, what do you do? How do you defend? Obviously, you can't take on c4. You can't take on e4. Instead, d4 is the move, advancing the pawn and trying to keep it defended. Now, Magnus finally decides it is time to develop in this brand new opening, the Norwegian Bongcloud, and he does play the move knight to e2, developing, also pressuring d4 with the knight and the queen. Now, Fabiano, how does he respond? Knight c6 is the move, and then we have knight to f4. Magnus finding a very creative path for this knight, maybe intending knight d5 on the very next move, finding a nice outpost on d5 that really can't be challenged by many black pieces. All right, now, Fabiano, knight d7 is the move, retreating, and what on earth is the idea behind this move? I mean, this game's getting weirder and weirder as we go along. Magnus, knight d5. Nothing opposing the knight. It jumps into the very fine outpost. And Fabiano, I mean, the idea behind knight d7 basically was the move f5, attacking on the king's side. That is the only logical idea behind that move. And here f5 actually is very strong. But instead, Fabiano in the game, he does not go f5. Instead, the move is rook to e8. Fabiano getting cold feet here, being spooked by the new opening of Magnus Carlsen. And from here, Magnus simply takes over in this game. I mean, if Magnus wins after the new Norwegian Bongcloud opening, I don't know what I'm going to do. I mean, it's got to be something insane. All right, from here, Magnus, bishop f4. He develops a solid idea. Black, knight d to e5, finding a good outpost for that knight. Now, Magnus, he trades on e5. We have bishop takes, and then rook takes. The rook going essentially back and forth from e8 to e5, and back again, and now Magnus, bishop d3, trying to finish development of his kingside pieces. Now, black, f5. The f-pawn break does finally come into the game. Black here putting a tremendous amount of pressure on the very poor e4 pawn. Now, from here, Magnus, the GOAT. Simply the move is rook to e1, sliding over with the rook, reinforcing e4, and finally finishing development of your kingside pieces. The king. And the king on the f2 square, I mean, that still doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me in this game, but that is just Magnus for you. All right, now black here. He trades on e4. F takes e4 is the move for Fabiano Caruana, the American super GM. Now, bishop takes is the response, and here black, bishop to f5, flying out with the bishop and trying to trade off the critical bishop on the e4 square, which is on a fantastic square for right now. Here, Magnus. He trades on f5. Bishop takes f5 is the move. Rook takes is the response. And now here, Magnus f4, gaining space and trying to reinforce this f-pawn on the f-file. Maybe intending ideas like perhaps queen to f3, rook a d1, and so on, trying to centralize. Now black does go queen d7, developing his queen. And now Magnus, rook b1, sliding over, pressuring b7, being annoying in general. And black does go rook a to f8, finally bringing his last piece out into the game. Both sides pretty much have completed development of their pieces, and therefore, finally, the middle game sort of has begun in this game. All right, Magnus, king g1, sliding back with the king. Now, Fabiano, rook 5 to f7, rook b2, rook e8, rook b to e2, both sides fighting for control of the open e-file, the e-file being perhaps the most important file in this game right now. Now, Fabiano, rook f to f8, supporting his rook on the e8 square with the other rook. Now, Magnus, a4. A very strange looking move, gaining space on the queen's side, but in doing so, weakening this pawn a little bit and making it a little bit more vulnerable. All right, Fabiano, queen to f7, sliding over with his queen. Queen d3 is the move for Magnus, and now finally one pair of rooks does trade off the board. We have rook takes, queen takes, and then rook d8, pressuring the knight a little bit, but also supporting the pawn on d4 indirectly with the rook. Now, from here, Magnus, queen d4, centralizing. Black goes g6. And from here, what is your plan, Magnus? What are you going to do right here to further increase the pressure in this game? I mean, your knight on d5 is fantastic. Your queen, excellent on e4. Your rook on e1, also very well placed. And surprisingly, somehow, someway, the king on g1 is now a pretty safe piece. And despite the insane opening, you do have the edge in this middle game versus Fabiano, your longtime rival. Well, here, Magnus, he's going for the win, and he busts out the insane idea of G4, gaining space on the king side, maybe threatening F5 later. Magnus Carlsen going for the attack on the king side. All right, black, king to F8, slides over with the king. King to F2, marching up the board with the king. The king march for Magnus begins. King G7, and now king to G3. Magnus initiating one of the weirdest king maneuvers I've ever seen in a game. The king is now a fighting piece on the G3 square with the queen still on the board. Magnus, what have you become in this game? All right, king to F8. The king slides back. H3 defends G4. A6. King to F3. The king continues its weird march in this game. Now king G7. And finally here, Magnus, he's had enough. He's had his fun. And he finally trades the queens off the board, or at least tries to, with the move queen to E6, offering the queen trade. Magnus, of course, being the GOAT of endgames. It makes a lot of sense here. And Fabiano, he does oblige. We have queen takes, then rook takes, and then king to F7, sliding over, attacking the rook, and really, anything can happen in this endgame. It is simply dead even with many, many pieces still on the board. Now from here, Magnus, F5 is the move, gaining space and supporting the rook on the E6 square. Now black here, he trades on F5. We have G takes, and then rook G8, sliding over and assuming control of the newly opened G file. Now white, rook to H6, pressuring H7. Black does defend king G7, and then rook D6 sliding over and threatening rook D7 with the fork on the king and the B7 pawn. Black here, he must respond, and the move is simply rook to F8. The idea being if rook D7, rook F7 does defend, at least for right now. But of course, Magnus here, having the extra passed pawn on the F file, he is a little bit favored in this game. He's simply a little bit ahead in this pawn race. All right, Magnus, king to F4. Jumps up with the king. And here in this position on move 41, Fabiano makes a very critical blunder. He plays the move D3. Now, this right here is simply not the way forward. The pawn on D3 is now too vulnerable. On D4, it was supported by the knight, and there's no easy way for white to win the pawn. But now, after D3, the pawn is very, very vulnerable, and Magnus here finds the killer idea. Knight to C7, jumping in with the knight, threatening knight E6 with the fork on the rook and the king. This is the way, this is the idea. Black, he sees the idea. Rook C8, defends and attacks the knight, but now knight E6 comes anyway, hitting the king on G7. King to F7 is the response, and now here, Magnus, he simply cleans up that pawn on D3. Rook takes D3. We are seeing in real time the drawback of D3 by black. Again, the pawn is simply too vulnerable on D3, and white just gobble it up right away. All right, Fabiano, knight E7, pressuring C4. That is the idea, but this is not a good idea. Magnus, knight G5, hits the king. King to E8 is the move, and here Magnus is simply winning. He has too much pressure. The pawn is too easy to defend, and for example, rook D4 here for white would be completely winning. Now, this move right here, rook D4, is not that hard to find, but Magnus here finds a different idea. King to E5, which looks logical, closing in on the black king, but this turns out to be a massive blunder, and black starts to fight back in this game. Rook C5 hits the king, king to E6, and then knight takes F5. The rook maneuver, ganging up on F5, and now the C4 pawn also is very, very loose. Knight E4 is the response, hitting the rook and trying to remove the defender of that knight, but now simply knight G7 hits the king, and the knight is getting away. King D6 is the response, and now rook takes C4 is the move. King to E5, rook takes A4, and Fabiano Caruana, despite being down most of this game, he's fought his way back. He has assumed control in this wild game, starting with the Norwegian Bongcloud opening. He's now up 2 pawns on the queen side with decent winning chances. All right, Magnus here. Knight D6 is the move, hitting the king and the pawn on B7, trying to win back at least 1 pawn as soon as possible. Black, king to E7 is the response. Now, knight takes B7. We have rook to H4, pressuring H3, and now here, rook to A3, pressuring A6 in response. Rook to H6 defends the pawn. That is absolutely the right idea by Fabiano, but now Magnus, knight C5, pressures the pawn anyway. Now, rook H5, hits the king and skewers the king and the knight, but king d4 does defend. Now a5, advancing the pawn. Rook takes, and then knight e6 hits the king and the knight. Now we have king c4, knight takes, and rook takes h3. In the end here, Fabiano having the single extra rook pawn, is that enough to win the game? Let's find out. King d4, king f6, king e4, king g6, king to f4, rook to h5, offering the trade. Magnus here, he accepts, rook takes, and now Magnus here, he knows his king and pawn endgames. He knows if the king gets to the h1 square, it is a draw, as there is simply no way to force the king away from that square. King g3, king g5, king h2, king h5, king h1, and it's going to be a draw. King g5, king g1, king h5, king h1, and both sides do agree to a draw, and here is the proof. If the king tries to advance, there's simply no way to force the king away from the h1 square, and therefore the pawn cannot promote, and it would be a draw anyways. Wow, what a game between Magnus Carlsen, the GOAT, and the undisputed king of new chess openings, and Fabiano Caruana in the new opening I'm calling the Norwegian Bongcloud opening. Alright, Chess YouTube, that is all for today. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please smash that like button, comment down below your thoughts on this new opening, the Norwegian Bongcloud opening, and real fast, if you are tired of watching endless chess YouTube videos, whether it's mine or anyone else's, and you're just not making the kind of progress you want to with your online chess, I know the feeling, and I built my free online community, drmikechess.com, to help people exactly like you. When you join, it's totally free to join. You get a free community, free courses, free coaching calls, everything you need to succeed. And my students there are making insane progress. My best student so far to date has gained 400 ELO in a single month, but many of my students are easily gaining 100 to 200 plus ELO. In fact, literally today, my student Dylan gained, or he reported, he gained 171 ELO in the past 30 days. If you want results like that a lot of my guys are making right now, go to drmikechess.com. That is the URL, but the link's down below in the pinned comment and the description as well. I will see you there. It's free to join. Jump on in, and as always, I wish you the best of luck in your chess improvement journey in 2025 and beyond, and I will see you in the next video.